Hi and welcome back to Summing Up. This week I'm joined by my first returning guest, Sadie Nicholls. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me again.
So last time we caught up and talked about overseas income, a podcast which is actually doing really well so far. So wanted to get you back in to talk about something a little bit different. But how did you enjoy your first time on the pod, and have you been looking forward to round two?
Returning. I have. No, it's good. It's good to get the information out there and to talk things through, oversimplify what can be quite a complex piece of legislation and guidance, and just put it in simplistic terms for everybody out there to understand it and know that they're not in the same, that they're not the only people that potentially have this source of income or these sorts of queries, and that I'm here. Just pick up the phone, talk to me. Everything can be discussed and resolved if need be.
I think that's the thing. People just need to know that they have an issue and the right person to talk to.
That's right.
And I think, that's, as I say, our first get together was excellent. So you're back again, and I appreciate that. And what will we be talking about today?
Today, we're going to talk about internationally mobile employees, and we're going to look at it from the UK aspect under the domestic laws of this country for the employer and the employee.
Okay, understood. So from my point of view, let's take it down a level to where I come from initially. We act for UK employers, UK companies based in the UK, pay their tax over here, and I assume they may have UK-based employees going abroad to work. They may also have overseas workers coming to the UK to work for them. So with those two scenarios, shall we just start by talking through the points around tax initially of a UK individual going to work abroad?
Yes, of course. So the key thing is we've got a UK company that has an employee. Now, whether the employee decides to go to another country and requests that they do remote working, or if they're seconded overseas by their employer, that can change the scenario of the reporting obligations.
Yeah.
But what we need to do is to establish whether the employer has a taxable presence in the new jurisdiction, and what that means for the employer's reporting obligations and also the employees personally. So we need to look at income tax, we need to look at social security, and the rules differ for the two. The double taxation agreement doesn't cover social security, it's a separate agreement. The social security reciprocal agreement is with the EU and EEA countries.
Yep.
They also have one with various other countries across the world, but they also don't have them with countries as well. So the outcome could be very different depending on where you send your employee or where they choose to go and live. So it's really important that we look at the individual facts of each case to determine what the next steps are. But the key point is to establish what, as an employer, what your obligations are. In the UK, what continue to be the case here in the UK, and what might you trigger in the new jurisdiction. And you're going to be governed by the domestic laws of that country, and it's fully understanding that. Also for the individual, if they trigger tax residency in the other country, what does that mean for them?
I see, yeah. So in terms of some of the advice that I would be giving to my clients where they are trading or have an active presence in an overseas territory, it's whether they may be caught by corporation tax, for example. So I'm sure the rules aren't the same, but it's that kind of logic, isn't it? Is the company undertaking sufficient activities in that foreign country that triggers them to have to report, set up a payroll scheme and report employees in that territory under that country's tax law? That's what we're getting at here.
Correct, that's exactly it. And whilst we might have an employer, they will be governed by the same rules as you've just highlighted as self-employed individuals for a different reason. So they may well trigger a permanent establishment by virtue of their individual employee working there, depending on what the employee's role is.
I see.
Which could dictate whether they have a taxable presence there for corporation tax purposes. Yeah. Furthermore, that won't go side by side, but it could be that you're in a position as an employer that you don't trigger a permanent establishment, so you don't have to do corporation tax, etc. However, you still have to do payroll reporting in that country, and that's where things can become more complicated and administration burdens arise.
It sounds like the potential, the bar of potentially having to register as an employer in a foreign country may be relatively low. And is this an area where some UK companies that we advise don't realise they should have registered as an overseas employer, and that's where we come in to help?
That's exactly where we come in to help.
Yeah.
And I see it all too often. Either an employee has requested that they go and work overseas and remain employed by their UK employer. Nobody's taken any advice. We could be 2-3 years down the line. And what's happened is they've remained on the UK payroll, which isn't correct because they don't have any UK work days. And actually they're governed by the other country's domestic law. They are likely to need to operate a payroll there, and they've got taxes due there. What's important for the employer to note is when we're looking at the social security legislation, as I mentioned before, that's not covered by the double taxation agreement, and there's no credit available for social security. You stop paying it in one country and you start paying it in the other. And also because that isn't covered by the taxation agreement, it's got a different set of rules. But ultimately speaking, you are likely to need to pay social security in the country in which you are living and working.
Right.
And furthermore, the employee's social security, the country in which you determine their liabilities to be due, the employers are likely to follow suit.
Yeah, okay.
And what can happen, which I have seen before, is as an employer, you employ an individual and you know what that individual will cost you as an employer, and you've taken that into account when you're computing their salary and the cost to you as a business. Now, you've based that on UK social security rates. If they are due in a different country, they may well be higher. And I have seen it on many occasions where they are almost double to the UK.
Oh, okay.
So the cost of that employee to you as a business, that's now got significantly higher, which is why I said earlier, there can be significant differences if you've seconded an employee or if they've actually chosen to go and made that request. Social security is a huge factor in remote working, and there are other things to take into consideration, like if you are working within the EU, you can apply for something called an A1 certificate, which, as long as you meet certain qualifying conditions, you request to stay in your home country's social security system, which simplifies matters somewhat.
Yes, of course it would do.
Because you may have an employee that's going overseas for a couple of years, then they've paid into their social security system for a couple of years, and they've come back to the UK and their state pension record has got gaps in it and things like that. So there's lots of elements to look at when you're looking at working in other jurisdictions.
I guess it's logical to think, and this is obviously not the case, that the tax and what you say social security, I say national insurance.
National insurance, sorry,
exactly.
The same thing.
No, that's right, but we call it national insurance, and other countries, I'm sure they don't. But you would think the two things are so connected because in the UK, you pay your tax and your national insurance at the same time, and through the payroll or on your personal tax return. But of course, overseas, that's not necessarily the case. And from what you're saying, I'm hearing that these two things are very, very different. And whilst there are lots of rules, as you say, around the tax and the double taxation agreements whereby you pay tax in one country and could potentially get relief in another, the same not being the case for social security, this is potentially a bigger headache and a stronger reason to get your affairs in order early than anything else, really. Yeah,
I couldn't agree more. Social security can be quite a headache, especially when you're mopping up earlier years. It's quite difficult in the UK and my experience in other countries to try and request refunds for social security, national insurance. Especially I had a case with the US not so long ago, and they said it will cost too much in professional fees for your client to actually try and obtain a refund. It's just not possible. They should have taken the advice from the outset, and it's taking a pragmatic approach. At that point, that won't always be the case, but just to highlight, it's really important if you're thinking about seconding an employee or an employee's raised this question with you, pick up the phone, give me a call, send me an email. It's really important that you get everything in order ahead of it starting or shortly after, so you're not tripped up along the way.
And this scenario where the UK employer is sending a member of staff overseas, or they're asking to work remotely overseas, I'm kind of hearing that the main issues are with the employer, but I guess that's not the case, and the employee themselves needs to instigate advice and take advice on these topics from their perspective also.
That's absolutely right. So when I take on a project like this, I'm advising the employer on their obligations, and then I'm advising the individual, because that's going to come down to their tax residency position, which will dictate, when we look at the double taxation agreement, we're looking at the specific article of employment in this case, and it's for the individual. We look at the employer and what they need to meet and their reporting obligations, but the individual is ultimately the one that has their income tax liability to be dealt with, in addition to Social Security.
Yep.
The Social Security will largely be dealt with through the employer, but the individual needs to review their residency position on the year of departure, how many days they're going to be outside of the country, whether they will actually come back and have some UK work days, which is when we then will start to look at different PAYE schemes. HMRC have a number of modified payroll schemes in place currently to assist with inbound and outbound employees, where it's not just your straightforward live in the UK, work in the UK, pay all of your income tax, pay your Social Security, as we all know it. There's lots of other modified payroll schemes in place to assist with the mobile nature of these individuals working in other countries and having ad hoc days here or there. And each country will want to capture the income tax on each working day, and that's where I come into it again to review who's got the taxing rights over it, where does it need to be reported, and that's the individual's personal tax residency position will largely dictate that.
Yeah, okay, and so we're talking from an employer's perspective and an employee, but I assume that logic then also follows to self-employed individuals. Not everybody works for an employer. A consultant, whoever it might be, who works for themselves, self-employed, they go and work abroad. That's very much the advice you were just setting out that would apply to that person, and they really do need to understand from day one, if you don't get that relief on the Social Security costs especially, what's going to be happening in the new territory, how much tax is going to be paid, and also just registering, setting up how I go about paying it. All these things are going to be new, aren't they?
And all of the costs incurred for that as well, and the costs in other jurisdictions that I've had in my experience, the cost for just setting up a payroll is very expensive compared to us here in the UK. But you're quite right, self-employed individuals will work much in the same way. We would be looking at the taxation agreement to review the business profits article for them to dictate. But you're going to have a period of time when they're going to still have taxable elements of their earnings, income, profits here in the UK. And it's who gets to have the primary taxing rights, secondary taxing rights, sole taxing rights, and is Social Security due? Because you wouldn't ordinarily have Social Security in one country for a few days and then Social Security here for a few days. You take a pragmatic approach. In that case. It's not like income tax. It's not as clear cut.
No, understood. I think that there's a lot of detail, I'm sure, that we can go into around the area of UK individuals going and working abroad, either for an extended period or for a limited period of time. But I wanted to just turn to overseas individuals coming to the UK and start off, I guess, by talking about those that are coming to work for a UK employer, taking employment in the UK, but in the past have been overseas resident or even overseas domiciled. But what are the main factors around those types of individuals? So
for those individuals, the position would change. If they come and work here for a UK employer, then that's pretty straightforward from the UK employer's perspective. They'll go on the UK payroll if all their duties are performed here. If they're UK tax resident, the year that they arrive, will then need to do a residency review and a corresponding split year claims. That should be fairly straightforward, although it does need advice on. However, if we have individuals come to the UK that work for an overseas employer, that's when it gets interesting.
Right.
Because what we then need to review is, does the overseas employer have a taxable and a PAYE presence here in the UK? And if the answer is no, this can come as quite a surprise to the employees themselves. But if the answer is no, then it's down to the individual employees to operate and run and set up their own payroll. And there are specific designated payrolls schemes in place for circumstances like that, because it does actually happen quite often. I see it regularly and I advise on it regularly. So it's the employee understanding, by them choosing to come and live and work in another country, what's the true cost to them as an individual? Have they got all of the advice beforehand? And if they have and they're happy with it, that's great. It's just you don't want to get tripped up further down the line. Everything is achievable. Everything can be worked through. It's just getting an understanding and having the professional advice and assistance to get you set up and on your way, basically, so that you can do what you came here to do, which is work. And I can confirm your net cash position and what your reporting obligations are. And you can keep doing what you're doing best, doing your job.
Exactly, yeah. That's a really interesting point, actually, and something I hadn't realised. That, okay, I guess it's the reverse of the conversation we had earlier. A UK employer sending someone abroad needs to establish whether they need to register as an employer in that country. Somebody coming to the UK from overseas, from an overseas employer, they do the same consideration, the same calculations as to whether they need to register in the UK, whether they have that permanent establishment here. But if they don't, you're saying the employee, the worker, has to register their own employment scheme in the UK.
That's right, and operate. So it's not for the PAYE obligations. It doesn't just come down to permanent establishment qualifying conditions. There's other taxable presence guidance that needs to be adhered to. Now, and if you don't meet them, then yes, the employee needs to operate their own, which does come as quite a shock to employees, certainly ones that I act for, because they've then got monthly payroll fees. They've got their social security pay here, which they knew anyway. Now, it does also, by having these designated schemes, you can choose to pay your income tax through self-assessment rather than through this specific national insurance-based employment scheme. But there's things to consider like pension and the auto-enrolment things. So they will fall in line with all of the usual PAYE obligations here, just as the employee acting as the employer, which can get quite confusing to the individual. As you can imagine, you wouldn't even consider any of this would be applicable to you personally. But unfortunately, in some circumstances, it is. Yeah, absolutely. It does certainly feel like it requires a specialist to help with many of these things. You just touched on a point there that I had jotted down to talk about, which was around pensions. And I know last time we spoke, we talked about UK individuals that maybe had overseas pensions that they weren't declaring for tax. And I guess there's some connection there, isn't there, to people coming to the UK, contributing, those going abroad, contributing to pensions, not just the workplace pension rules, but also the concept of having a pension fund, either within the UK tax system or outside of that, and the complications that may present. That sounds like, again, an area where advice is going to be needed, and potentially, I assume there are people out there that just don't do things soon enough and get caught out, but that the whole concept of pensions for these people must be an interesting one to deal with. It is, and it does coincide when you're looking at the remote working individuals, whether they're coming or going. You're quite right, because what is likely to happen is you have an overseas employee come here and they continue paying into their overseas pension. Now, the question is, can they obtain the higher rate tax relief here on that pension contribution? Oh, I see. And so we then need to look at the relevant article in the double taxation agreement between the two countries. So I keep referring to the taxation agreement, but it's so important because it dictates what our next steps are before referring to the domestic law. And in some cases, tax relief may not be due. It may be due. How are we able to claim the tax relief here? And whilst we're on the subject of pensions, going back to the individuals who are operating their own payroll, this may sound silly, but because of the guidance that's in place, there may be a scenario where they have to contribute to their own pension fund through this specific scheme if they don't opt out. They fall in line with usual employers where they have to register it.
Yeah.
But then that's where our advisory arm comes in, and we then look at whether they go down the automatic percentage deduction route, or if actually we opt out and we do a whole tax planning exercise as to what that would look like. And then you're then looking at our financial planning team as to whether that's a UK fund or an overseas fund. So pensions in itself is a whole different aspect, but it certainly comes into play with the remote working individuals for different reasons, because as we all do, we pay into our pension on a monthly basis.
Yeah.
That's likely to be the case for the overseas individuals coming here as well.
Yeah, and securing tax relief on those contributions, as you say, is important. It's a lot of the motivation that people actually pay into pensions.
Exactly.
So securing that is really vital. Sadie, I think actually I thought this was going to be quite a turbulent and confusing discussion, but I think the way that you've set these key points out is really easy to understand and sensible. So from my point of view, I think obviously anybody with an employee that's going abroad, coming to the UK, or those individuals themselves need to think about these things as early as possible, and leaving it to the last minute is not the way to go. But at what stage, is it when the flights are booked and the deposit is put down on the house that they need to get in touch, or is it, as we do in the UK, a tax return is filed a year in? At what stage should somebody ideally get in touch for an initial chat with you?
When they're initially thinking, should I go overseas?
Really, that early?
Yes.
Okay.
I think it's really important for you as an individual and your employer to have the full facts of what it will look like in each jurisdiction ahead of you going. And then everybody understands what the true cost is for the employee. What is their net cash position going to be from their wages each month? What is the cost of that employee going to be to the employer? Because the answers to those may actually make the decision that you don't want to go overseas. Yeah. Tax and reporting may not be the main driver, but for me personally, I would want to know all the facts up front, and then you're well informed with everything to make an educated decision on whether you make the decision, you make the move, and that's great, and that's where I can talk you through, and you then have all of the facts in front of you to know exactly where you're going to be.
Fine, understood. And I think one of the other takeaways that I think I'm pulling from that discussion is that whilst lots of the tax, predominantly income tax side of things is documented, and there's agreements, double taxation agreements, where you can get relief from one country to another, as we touched on in our previous discussion actually. There feels like there's an area here around social security that is vitally important, and the mechanisms in place are just not as flexible. And potentially, is it fair to say that social security in a lot of these cases is more of a significant point than tax?
I would agree.
Yeah.
It is. The advice that I provide is heavily dominated around social security, national insurance. It plays a huge part in it, and that dictates the reporting obligations of it. It doesn't happen often, but I would say that social security is the main driver, one of the key factors to consider with working relationships in the UK and overseas.
So in summary, if anybody thinks they may have an issue,
get in
touch with you, and you can help.
That's it. I can help, I can advise, I can guide you through the process. As a firm, we deal with the compliance of these modified payrolls. We make the application, we run the payrolls, and I will have advised you on everything in advance of that, but we can take you through the whole process and operate them for you on a monthly basis.
Yeah.
So we really can take you from the beginning right the way through.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for your time again, Sadie, and many thanks for returning. And I'm sure there'll be some other topics that we can catch up again in due course. So I really appreciate you coming in to speak to us today. And thanks everybody for tuning in. Got a few podcasts out now, so please have a look back at some of the previous discussions I've had with my guests. And if you would like to give us a follow and a like, that'd be much appreciated. See you all next time.